The postmodern styles and perspectives of millennials and Generation Z are really nothing new. They are the logical extensions of a modernism more than a century old. While the 1920s supplied the images of modernism in the public imagination, the social spiritual revolution exploded in the 1910s. It was the ascendancy of the counter-Christ culture still in progress, shaping a new world order and a Gnostic occult spirituality. The Ragtime Revolution was centered in Manhattan, the shimmering Queen City in the darkness, an electrified metropolis, the rattle and hum in God's own quiet night. But man, in his pride and vainglory, had lit up the Gotham night as if by the torch of the light-bearing Lady Liberty, that transgendered Apollo from the Freemasons in France. Social dance was a seismic cultural event within ragtime, forming the human topography we take for granted today. Out of this landscape came intimate, close-body dancing between the sexes, nightlife, black music consumed by white audiences, racialization of music in general, secularism, and ostentatious displays of wealth, drug and alcohol recreation, celebrity idols, and more. Less obvious but of greater impact were the soul bonds forged to music, entertainment, and entertainers. 1910's Manhattan gave birth to multitudinous expressions of what I refer to as the dirty dozen of counter-Christ iniquities: materialism, the urge to dominate, self-centeredness and pride, hypersexuality, intoxication, idolatry, bigotry, dishonesty, Gnostic occultism and the rebellious spirit, violence, chaos, profanity, and blasphemy. It is the goal of the angelic rebellion against God and its human collaborators to construct a counter-Christ culture, convincing God that humanity is unworthy of being in his family and dragging as many of its members into damnation as possible. The iniquities foster in individuals the feeling that they do not need God, even that they are their own God. In America, most of us are already there, even many who believe themselves to be Christians. This installment of the Song and Dance of Black and White series on the Ragtime Revolution tells an important part of the story of how we got here and where we're going. It also clarifies the responsibility of followers of Messiah to disaffiliate from the iniquities, to walk out of Babylon. The 6 degrees of separation personage in this story is the, in many ways, magnificent James Reese Europe, orchestra leader and conscious agent for the uplift of the race. Musical artist and Broadway impresario Eubie Blake, who was a close associate of Europe and whose life spanned 100 years, said that James Reese Europe was in a class with Martin Luther King and Booker T. Washington, and I met all three, he said. Blake lauded his mentor as the savior of Negro musicians. Before Europe, black musicians were like wandering minstrels, play in a saloon and pass the hat. Before Jim, they weren't even supposed to be human beings. Jim changed all that. He made a profession for us out of music. All of that we owe to Jim, if only people would realize it. Europe's mission was begun amidst the intense hustle, bustle, and exchange of ideas at Manhattan's Marshall Hotel. This was the gathering place for the so-called talented tenth in the black community of New York, which realistically reflected the most educated and prosperous 1/10 of 1%. However, there is no denying that most of the Marshall patrons had multi-generational family and social ties to money, education, and sometimes the white upper class. James Reese Europe came from a long line of freedmen and preachers who formed the core of black leadership. As such, they and those allowed through the gates to climb the social ladder were already very high up on the radar of those with active interest in engineering society on behalf of its wealthier members. James Reese Europe lived in the same Washington, D.C. neighborhood as music celebrity John Philip Sousa, and was in fact schooled in music by Sousa's director, as well as by the grandson of Frederick Douglass. Coming to New York in 1903, Europe was recruited into the Freemasons, a member of Hiram Lodge, which is where the name came from for the father of Archie Comics character Veronica Lodge. At its most basic, Freemasonry is about farming human assets. That is why every little town in America has or had a Masonic lodge right in the middle of it. Keep tabs on anyone who might be of potential use through skills or influence in working toward the so-called great work of Freemasonry, a world united in governance and spirituality. For James Reese Europe, the Masons provided an invaluable network of contact and communication. Europe marketed and sold his syncopated dance music compositions as representative of a distinct African American culture. Most assuredly, Europe focused his considerable talents in terms of uplifting the race much more than he did feathering his own nest. In private conversation, he made it very clear that in order to advance the position of black musicians and black people generally, it was important to curry the favor of the very rich. With these members of the power elite, Europe defined what black music was and what it was not to a large extent. Much was excluded. This resulted in race music being a distinct commodity and black musicians in the 1910s earning more money than white musicians in New York as purveyors of authentic black music. James Reese Europe was likely never aware of the hidden agendas of social and spiritual engineering underlying the elite determinism he so cogently recognized. Much of what James Reese Europe did to uplift his race would backfire. Over the next decades, white resistance to black social equality would stiffen. The racial essentialism Europe claimed only allowed black people to authentically play black styles of music like ragtime, reinforced and entrenched the stereotyped positions of the earliest European contacts with African culture, which claimed that music and dance were part of the black essence, and therefore individual artists received no individual credit for what was allegedly in their blood. Furthermore, this musical propensity demonstrated that blacks were like children and unfit for self-governance, citizenship, or freedom. This was part of the objective of power elitists like William Randolph Hearst, inspired by the unclean spirit such men were open to when willfully ignorant or deliberately disobedient to the commandments of God. Such ingrained notions of innate racial disparities sometimes led to tragic consequences. Carnage was unleashed across America in the Red Summer of 1919. Black veterans came home, demanding jobs in recognition of the equality they had earned by their combat service. It was not lost upon an uneasy white population, manipulated by the programming of the elite to feelings of entitlement through skin color, that these vets returned to a Jim Crow America after having fought for freedom and having acquired the experience of shooting white men on the battlefield in France. Just at the onset of Red Summer, in the midst of a successful homecoming tour, Lieutenant James Reese Europe met the unexpected and bizarre end to his life. The band leader, having just brought jazz to Europe, died of wounds received backstage at the hands of his drummer. It was May 9th, 1919. We will never know how this consummate raceman would have exercised the respect and authority he had earned in addressing the white-on-black bloodshed of Red Summer. He was known to solemnly believe not only in the uplift, but in the defense of his race. No telling what kind of public comments he would have made on this racial strife. But we do know he was not just any barrelhouse musician, but recognized as an innovative musical genius and a patriot, a leader in the trenches and on the battlefield of his Harlem Hellfighters. It is likely that confronted with unprovoked violence against his people of this magnitude, his words and actions may have at last deviated from the sensational headlines and conspicuous silence in the media of his benefactor, William Randolph Hearst, and the counter-Christ power elite he represented. Instead of hearing from this respected quarter, America was plunged more deeply and viciously into Jim Crow. So-called negrobilia images dominated toys and commercial art, seeking to stitch and close the old Civil War Reconstruction rift between Northern and Southern whites, while uniting them both as masters of the other race, and thereby unifying all whites in a mass commercial market and a political system which routinely rubber-stamped or ignored the worst kind of evils. This was successful spiritual warfare being waged upon the people of God by victimizing one side and playing to the baser instincts of the other. In the process, many individuals on both sides were overwhelmed by intense emotions that proved fertile ground for the enemy to proceed with his sinister agenda. Emotions of rage, inferiority, superiority, wounds of the soul seeking a salve in addictions and distractions. Following the death of James Reese Europe, the black music he had defined and commodified found itself being artificially augmented with unsavory habits and associations. Instead of the church and worship, long the core of African American society, the powers that be sought to disengage God's people from this identity and supplant it with one manufactured from the frame of entertainment and its lower class venues. The more flagrant and casual sexuality given expression in the dances to Europe's syncopated music, drugs and its supposed attendant secret Gnostic consciousness and in-group understandings. These identities through song and story were implanted in the minds of all whites and sadly made inroads within the black community as well. This process would cast in stone the unholy trinity of sex, drugs, and music. The bad boy genius of Little Louis Armstrong would soon explode onto the jazz scene in all its cannabis-clouded glory. Not that the general public had much of an idea of the prodigious amounts of marijuana smoked on a daily basis by Satchmo, but other musicians surely did. And as Mesro noted in his landmark autobiography, Really the Blues, everybody figured that if Louis Armstrong could smoke like that and blow a horn like that, well, maybe then they should do it too. A couple of decades later, Charlie Bird Parker likewise inspired such derelict emulation by turning heroin addiction into a badge of artistic and social integrity. Mesro, a white man who self-identified as black at the onset of the Great Depression, fancied himself as the Johnny Potseed of Harlem and became the primary avenue through which marijuana smoking expanded out of these small jazz enclaves and into the general population, first among young African Americans and then among white youths. This missionary zeal and Mesro's autobiography, well promoted by the powers that be, would give powerful impetus to the birth of the concept of cool and the formation of the Beat Generation. Drugs are pharmakia, sorcery, to open portals to the spirit world, and not the kind of spirits that you'd want to be contacting. Such profound social outcomes have made me wonder about the official story of James Reese Europe's death. In Lawrence Carter's U.B. Blake Keys of Memory, Blake gives a startling account regarding Europe's death not given in any other biography. He says that after the stabbing, Europe's bleeding had stopped completely when a black doctor from Washington, D.C., whom Blake described as one of these self-important bullies, took over the emergency room scene. Before anyone could stop him, he tore off the bandage and severed the vein. Jim gave a gasp, and he was dead. My guess is that if there was anything more to Europe's murder, or death rather, than what meets the eye, it was the result of his integrity and the respect he commanded and demanded for himself and his people. As the most prominent band leader and African-American war hero, he would have been the go-to guy for the black press, even if the Hearst newspapers decided to shut him out. It is unlikely that he would have equated freedom with dissipations like drinking, sexual promiscuity, drugs, and the desire for attention. He would have stuck out like a sore thumb in the gangster and speakeasy era. He was no rough and tumble out of the streets Louis Armstrong, nor a slick go along and get along good timer like Duke Ellington. Certainly not a flamboyant Cab Calloway, maniacally directing all attention to himself while extolling the virtues and excitement of the dope underworld. The images the power elite had planned to put forth of African Americans through the new mass media of radio and film were not congruent with his staid, even stodgy, hyper-disciplined demeanor. The image many whites would hold of black culture would still prevail all the way into the hip-hop era. Sex, drugs, violence, ignorance, sloth, and materialism. Nor did James Reese Europe fit in well with the post-World War I game plan of turning back the clock on equality and civil rights even further. There was a time when the nation's leading scientists, trust the science, remember, at the Ivy League universities of Harvard, Princeton, and Yale were proving, quote-unquote, black inferiority. This would be the springboard to the eugenics movement spearheaded by many of the most prominent families and used as an excuse to sterilize thousands of people of color as genetic defectives. It was in the 1920s and 30s when massive amounts of vice, prostitution, drugs, and alcohol were pushed into the poor black sections. Redlining of neighborhoods and discrimination barred black Americans from better neighborhoods as well as jobs. Refusal of banks to approve loans maintained the oppression. Lynchings became grotesque, mass spectacles, attended by thousands sometimes, with souvenir postcards and the barbaric and monstrous display of body parts in jars afterwards at local general stores. The hard-won gains of the black fighting men of World War I were all but wiped out, and African Americans found themselves insultingly barred from combat at the onset of World War II. In a few days, I'll post part 2 on the Ragtime Revolution and Counter-Christ culture. This is a segment of the series The Song and Dance of Black and White, Race, Entertainment, and the Spirit War to Remake Us. In part 2 of Ragtime Revolution, we'll explore the concept of black authenticity and music as put forth by James Reese Europe and demanded by his white audience. We'll also see the effect of this on black America at large and black music in particular. We'll see the dramatic impact President Woodrow Wilson had on race and advancement towards globalism through his endorsement of a white supremacist film, through unprecedented policies, and by involving America in World War I. We'll also see that long-term devastation was wrought by drug and alcohol policies enacted under this catastrophic presidency. We'll observe the beginnings of a nexus between folklore, anthropology, and popular music that will largely remake society and eventually open Americans to Eastern mysticism and the occult as part of the effort to undermine biblical Christianity. We will cover the landmark Carnegie Hall concert by James Reese Europe and his Clef Club band, an event saved from disaster by the machinations of media tycoon William Randolph Hearst. We will take a look at the Christian opposition to social dancing and the mania of the Salome dance, which swept America and the world. We'll have that and more for you in part 2 of the Ragtime Revolution and the Counter-Christ Culture. This is Gumbo Craig, and you're listening to Walking Out of Babylon, where we consider our present and future against the backdrop of the past. Please enjoy the slideshow. It goes on, I guess, for about another 5 minutes or so. Please remember to like and subscribe. It's a big help and greatly appreciated. All glory to the Most High God. Shalom.